Hello, and welcome back to Religious Stories for Sleep. I'm genuinely delighted you've decided to join me tonight, though I suspect decided might be generous. More likely, you're lying there in the dark, desperately scrolling through videos hoping anything, will finally let your brain shut down. Well, congratulations. You've found perhaps the only channel where learning about ancient Persian fire worship is considered a sedative. Tonight, we're venturing into the world of Zoroastrianism, one of humanity's oldest monotheistic religions, and specifically into the life of a fire temple keeper. Now, I know what you're thinking. How hard could it be to watch a fire? And that's precisely the kind of modern hubris that would have gotten you ceremonially expelled from a temple before lunch. You can't even remember to water your house plants, but sure, you'd be great at maintaining the eternal flame that represents the presence of Ahura Mazda himself. Absolutely. Before we begin this journey into a world of relentless purity, endless ritual and isolation that would make a lighthouse keeper's job look social, I do need to ask a small favor. If you find yourself enjoying this video, or more accurately, if you find yourself unconscious halfway through it, please consider subscribing to the channel. Leave a comment telling me which historical figure's boring life you'd like me to detail next. And, if you're feeling particularly generous before sleep claims you, do leave a like. It helps tremendously, and unlike the sacred fires we'll be discussing, your engagement requires only a single tap, not a lifetime of celibate devotion. Now then, let's settle in. Find a comfortable position. Take a breath. Imagine yourself transported back roughly 2,500 years to the Persian Empire at its height, to a world where fire wasn't just a convenient way to cook food or see in the dark, but a living symbol of truth, order, and the divine. A world where maintaining that fire was considered one of the most sacred duties a human being could perform, and a world where you, with your modern sensibilities and attention span calibrated for 30-second videos, would absolutely, categorically fail. Let's find out why. Picture yourself waking before dawn in a small stone chamber adjacent to the fire temple. And when I say before dawn, I don't mean that generous modern interpretation where you check your phone at 6:30 a.m. and consider yourself virtuous. I mean genuine darkness, the kind where night hasn't even begun its negotiation with morning, perhaps 4 in the morning by our reckoning, though of course you wouldn't be reckoning anything by clock time. You would wake because your body, after months or years of training, has learned that this is when you wake. Your first conscious thought would not be reaching for a device. It would be purity. You cannot touch the sacred fire in a state of impurity. This is not a guideline. This is not a suggestion left over from a more superstitious age. This is the foundational principle of your entire existence as a fire keeper. And purity, in the Zoroastrian understanding, is considerably more complex than you've been led to believe by your modern shower and a quick brush of the teeth. You would rise from your sleeping mat, not a bed, nothing so comfortable, and immediately begin the purification rituals. The first step is the padyab, a ritual washing that must be performed in a specific sequence. You would wash your hands, but not simply rinse them under water while thinking about what you're having for breakfast. Each hand would be washed separately, water poured from a vessel specifically designated for this purpose, never water that has touched the ground or been contaminated by contact with anything impure. The water flows over your right hand first, then your left, then your face, then your feet. The sequence matters. Get it wrong, and you must start again. Already, I suspect, you're finding this tedious. You haven't even left your chamber, haven't even approached the fire, and you're performing ablutions with the gravity of a surgeon preparing for operation. But this is your life now. This it is every morning. This will be tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that, until either you die or you're released from service. And release from service was not particularly common. The water itself must be pure. Not clean by our standards, pure by Zoroastrian standards, which is a considerably more demanding criterion. It cannot have been touched by dead matter. It cannot have been left standing exposed to the air for too long, where it might have been contaminated by insects or dust. The vessel containing it must have been properly maintained, cleaned according to ritual, stored correctly. You begin to see, perhaps, how a simple morning wash becomes an exercise in mindfulness, so intense it would exhaust a modern meditation practitioner. Once you've completed the padyab, you would dress. But again, not in the sense of pulling on whatever clothes happen to be nearby and relatively clean. Your garments as a firekeeper would be specific, ritually pure, and maintained with obsessive care. Typically, you would wear white representing purity, light, the qualities of Ahura Mazda himself. The cloth would be simple, usually cotton or linen, nothing that came from a dead animal. Zoroastrians held complex views about the contaminating nature of death, and wearing leather or wool from a slaughtered creature would be problematic at best, depending on the particular temple and era. You would also don the kushti, the sacred cord worn by all Zoroastrians, though yours as a priest would carry additional significance. This is not a belt. This is not a decorative element. The kushti is wound around the waist 3 times, knotted in specific ways, and throughout the day you would retie it repeatedly as part of prayer, rituals. Each time you tie it, you recite prayers. Each time you untie it for necessary purposes, you must retie it correctly, with the proper words. The kushti is your constant reminder of your faith, your covenant, your purpose. Now, finally dressed and purified, you might think you're ready to approach the fire. You would be wrong, delightfully, instructively wrong. Before you can enter the fire temple proper, you must ensure you are in the correct mental and spiritual state. This means prayer. Not a quick, "Please let me get through today," muttered under your breath, but formal prayers, recited in Avestan, the liturgical language of Zoroastrianism. Unless you've spent years in training, you wouldn't know Avestan. It's not a language anyone spoke casually even in ancient Persia. It was already archaic, already ceremonial. Imagine being required to recite lengthy passages in ancient Sanskrit or classical Latin before you're allowed to start your job every single day, and you begin to appreciate the intellectual demand being placed on you. The prayers themselves are beautiful if you understand them. They speak of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the supreme deity who represents truth, order, and goodness. They speak of the Amesha Spentas, the holy immortals who serve as emanations or aspects of Ahura Mazda. They speak of the constant battle between Asha, truth, order, righteousness, and Drujo, falsehood, chaos, evil. You're not just reciting words. You're positioning yourself spiritually on the side of order against chaos, aligning your will with the divine purpose. Before breakfast, before you've even seen the fire you're meant to tend. Let's say generously that you manage all of this, You wake in darkness. You perform your ablutions correctly. You dress in your ritual garments. You recite your prayers without error. Now, finally, you approach the fire temple itself. The temple is not what you're imagining. If you're picturing something grand, with soaring architecture and ornate decoration, you may be partly correct for the great temples in major cities, but many fire temples were considerably more modest. What they all shared was a central fire chamber, and this is where you're headed. Before you enter, there's another purification. You would remove your shoes. Feet are considered particularly prone to contamination. Touching the ground as they do, coming into contact with dead matter, dirt, impurity. In some temples, you might wash your feet again. You would certainly ensure your head is covered. Then, and only then, you would step across the threshold into the presence of the sacred fire. The fire chamber is dim despite the fire itself. Light comes primarily from the flames, which burn on a raised platform, usually stone, in the center of the room. The fire is not large by bonfire standards. It's not meant to provide heat to a large space. It's meant to burn eternally, which requires careful calibration. Large enough to sustain itself, small enough to be manageable with the fuel available. The flames dance and flicker, casting moving shadows on the walls, and in this moment, you're struck by what you've undertaken. This fire, these specific flames or their direct descendants, have been burning for years, decades, in some cases, centuries. The fire you're looking at may have been kindled from flames that burned when Cyrus the Great ruled Persia, transferred carefully from temple to temple, never allowed to die. You are now responsible for ensuring it continues. Your first duty is inspection. You must assess the state of the fire. Is it burning cleanly? Is the fuel being consumed at the proper rate? Are there any signs of contamination? This last point is crucial and would drive you slightly mad if you thought about it too long. Contamination could come from anything. Dust settling on the fuel, an insect flying into the flames, a draft bringing in air from an impure source. You must be vigilant, constantly vigilant, because allowing the sacred fire to become impure would be a catastrophic failure of your duty. The fuel itself is specific. Generally wood, but not just any wood. It must be dry, clean wood, from appropriate trees, properly prepared. Some sources suggest sandalwood or other aromatic woods for particularly important fires. The wood must be stored correctly, kept away from moisture, from insects, from any form of death or decay. You would inspect each piece before adding it to the fire, running your hands over it, checking for any sign of impurity. A piece of wood with insect boreholes? Contaminated. Wood that had gotten damp? Questionable at best. You become, over time, a connoisseur of wood quality that would baffle and bore anyone else in equal measure. When you add fuel to the fire, you don't simply toss it on, you pray. Each time, every single time you add wood, you're not performing a mundane task of maintenance. You're participating in a sacred ritual. You recite specific verses. You make specific gestures. You add the wood in a particular way that ensures the fire receives it properly. The fire is alive, in a sense. It represents the presence of the divine. You're not feeding a campfire. You're making an offering to Ahura Mazda himself. Throughout the day, you would repeat this process. The fire must be maintained constantly, but not in the sense of standing next to it every moment. Rather, you would return at regular intervals, perhaps every 2 or 3 hours, to inspect it, add fuel if necessary, ensure all remains as it should. Between these visits, you would have other duties, other prayers, other ritual activities. But the fire is always there in your mind, a constant presence demanding your attention, your care, your devotion. Now, let's discuss something you haven't thought about yet. Isolation. Firekeepers, particularly those tending the most sacred flames, often lived in significant isolation from the broader community. This wasn't punishment. This was necessity. The more contact you had with the outside world, the more opportunities for contamination. Every person you interacted with might be in a state of ritual impurity. Every object you touched might carry pollution. Every meal you ate, every garment you wore, every surface you came into contact with was a potential source of impurity that could compromise your ability to tend the sacred fire. Some firekeepers were celibate. Not all, but many, particularly those in the highest positions of responsibility. Celibacy served multiple purposes. It eliminated the ritual impurities associated with sexual activity. It eliminated the distractions of family life. And it reinforced the idea that the firekeeper had separated himself from worldly concerns to focus entirely on the divine. If you enjoy human companionship, physical intimacy, the simple comfort of conversation with friends, you would find this aspect of firekeeping particularly challenging. You would eat alone or with other firekeepers, but certainly not in public gathering places. Your food would need to be prepared according to strict guidelines. Zoroastrians had specific dietary laws, though not as extensive as some other religious traditions. Generally, you would avoid foods associated with death or impurity. The meat you ate, if you ate meat at all, would need to come from properly slaughtered animals. Many firekeepers likely ate primarily vegetarian diets simply because it was easier to ensure purity. Water, again, is a constant concern. You would drink only from pure sources, water that hadn't been contaminated. You would wash your eating vessels according to ritual. You would pray before and after meals, not a quick grace, but proper prayers acknowledging the gift of food, the bounty of Ahura Mazda, the constant battle against the forces of chaos and hunger. Are you beginning to understand? Are you beginning to grasp the totality of this life? Every moment is ritualized. Every action is suffused with religious significance. There is no downtime in the modern sense, no period where you're off duty, no moment when you can simply relax and be yourself without consideration for purity, order, and divine will. Let me paint you a specific scenario. It's midday now. You've been awake for 8 hours. You've already tended the fire 4 times. You've recited prayers perhaps a dozen times. You've eaten a simple breakfast of bread, cheese, and fruits, all checked for purity, all consumed with proper prayers. You're in your chamber, perhaps reviewing liturgical texts, perhaps meditating on the nature of Asha and Druj, when suddenly you hear a commotion outside. A visitor has arrived at the temple, perhaps a wealthy merchant seeking to make an offering. Perhaps a family coming to pray for a sick relative. This is not unusual. Temples were centers of community religious life, and people came regularly to seek blessings, make offerings, participate in ceremonies. But you, as a firekeeper, cannot simply greet them. First, you must assess your own state of purity. Have you remained pure since your last purification? Almost certainly yes, given how careful you've been, but you review your actions anyway. Then, before you can interact with these visitors, you need to understand their state. Have they properly purified themselves? Have they followed the correct protocols for approaching the temple? If they haven't, you cannot allow them near the sacred fire. You would need to instruct them, gently but firmly, on what they must do. They must wash. They must remove their shoes. They must cover their heads. They must be prepared to make their offering or prayer in the correct manner, with the correct words, with proper reverence. This requires social skills, patience, and a certain diplomatic capability that you may or may not possess. Some visitors would be knowledgeable, devout Zoroastrians who knew exactly what to do. Others might be more casual in their faith, requiring gentle correction. Still others might be foreigners, curious about this religion, uncertain of protocols. You would need to guide all of them without compromising the sanctity of the fire, without allowing impurity to enter the sacred space. After the visitors leave, you would need to purify yourself again. Their presence, however proper, still constitutes contact with the outside world. You would perform abbreviated ablutions, recite prayers, ensure you're ready to return to your duties. The fire still burns. The fire always burns, and you're responsible for it. Evening comes. The sun sets. Darkness returns, but your day is not over. In fact, in some ways, night duties were considered even more important than day duties. Darkness was associated with drudge, with chaos and evil. The fire burning through the night was a beacon of asha, of order and truth, pushing back against the darkness, both literal and metaphorical. You would tend the fire again, ensuring it had sufficient fuel to burn through the night. You would recite evening prayers, longer and more solemn than those of daytime. You would perhaps spend time in meditation, sitting in the presence of the flames, feeling their heat, watching their light, contemplating the nature of the divine. In the great fire temples, there might be multiple firekeepers working in rotation, ensuring the fire was never left unattended. But in smaller temples, you might be alone, completely alone, in a stone chamber, with a fire, in the middle of the night, for hours. The silence would be profound, not the silence of a modern night punctuated by distant traffic, humming appliances, the ambient noise of civilization. True silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the occasional sound of wind outside, perhaps the distant call of an animal. You sit, you watch, you wait, you pray. You ensure the fire continues to burn. This is not meditation as modern wellness culture understands it. This is not finding your center for 20 minutes before you go back to your busy life. This is hours of solitary vigilance, night after night, maintaining your focus on a single sacred duty. If you've ever tried to meditate for even 10 minutes and found your mind wandering to grocery lists, embarrassing memories from years ago, or random song lyrics, imagine doing this for 4, 5, 6 hours at a stretch. At some point deep in the night, you might allow yourself to sleep, but only if there are other fire keepers to maintain the watch, or if you've ensured the fire is absolutely stable and will continue burning safely. And even then, your sleep would be light, alert for any sound or sign that something was wrong. Fire keepers developed an almost supernatural awareness of their charges. They could tell from the sound of the flames if something was amiss. They would wake instantly if the fire needed attention. Let's say you manage all of this. Through some combination of deep faith, iron discipline, and perhaps a personality particularly suited to ritual and isolation, you make it through your first day. You've maintained the fire. You've kept yourself pure. You've performed all the required prayers and ceremonies. The fire still burns as the next dawn approaches, and you've successfully fulfilled your duty. Congratulations. Now do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, for years, possibly for the rest of your life. This was not a job in the modern sense, something you did for a paycheck and then went home to your real life. This was your life. The temple was your home. The fire was your constant companion, your charge, your purpose. Everything else, personal desires, ambitions, relationships, comfort, all of it was secondary to this single, all-consuming duty. And yet, remarkably, people did this. For centuries, across the Persian Empire and beyond, Zoroastrian firekeepers maintained their sacred flames with exactly this level of devotion. They lived lives of ritual purity and isolation that would seem impossibly constraining to modern sensibilities. They found meaning, purpose, and deep spiritual fulfillment in duties that we would find mind-numbingly tedious. The fire temples were not empty monuments. They were living centers of faith, maintained by individuals who had committed themselves entirely to the service of Ahura Mazda, to the preservation of Asha against Druj, to the keeping of the eternal flame that represented truth, order, and the divine presence in the world. You wouldn't have lasted a day. Neither would I, if I'm honest. We're creatures of comfort, of distraction, of constant stimulation and immediate gratification. The discipline required, the commitment demanded, the sheer relentless consistency of ritual purity and sacred duty, it's beyond what most of us could sustain. But understanding this, understanding the depth of devotion and the intensity of practice that characterized Zoroastrian firekeeping, helps us appreciate something important, that human beings are capable of extraordinary dedication when they believe in something deeply enough. That meaning and purpose can be found in repetition, in ritual, in duties that might seem tedious from the outside, but are experienced as sacred from within. The fires burned. For centuries they burned, maintained by individuals whose names we'll never know, whose daily struggles and small triumphs were never recorded, but whose collective effort preserved one of the world's oldest religious traditions through empires, invasions, and the relentless passage of time. The firekeepers kept their watch, and the flames, eternal as human devotion could make them, burned on through the darkness. Now then, having established that you would absolutely fail at maintaining a sacred fire with the required devotion, let's turn our attention to the man who started all of this. The individual whose spiritual revelations created the framework that made fire, keeping such an intensely demanding practice in the first place. We're going to explore the life of Zarathustra, or Zoroaster if you prefer the Greek rendering of his name, though I'll use Zarathustra because it sounds more authentic and therefore makes me sound more knowledgeable, which is really what we're all after, isn't it? Here's the first delightful problem with discussing Zarathustra's life. We have absolutely no idea when he lived. Scholars have placed him everywhere from 1500 BCE to 600 BCE, a range of roughly 900 years, which is not so much a margin of error as a complete admission of ignorance. Imagine if someone asked you, when Shakespeare lived, and you said, "Oh, sometime between the Norman Conquest and the Industrial Revolution." That's essentially where we are with Zarathustra. The traditional Zoroastrian dating places him much earlier, sometimes as far back as 6000 BCE, which would make him essentially prehistoric, but most modern scholars find this implausible. The most commonly accepted estimate places him somewhere around 1000 to 1500 BCE, in the Bronze Age, though some argue for a later date around 600 BCE, which would make him roughly contemporary with the Buddha, Confucius, and various other important religious and philosophical figures of what Karl Jaspers called the Axial Age. For our purposes, we'll work with the earlier dating, around 1200 BCE, because it fits better with the linguistic evidence from the Gathas, the hymns attributed to Zarathustra himself, which use a very archaic form of Iranian language. But please understand that this is speculation built on educated guesswork constructed from linguistic analysis. And if you prefer a different date, feel free to imagine all of this happening then instead. The uncertainty is part of the charm. The second delightful problem, we don't know exactly where he lived. Probably somewhere in the eastern Iranian plateau, possibly in what's now northeastern Iran, Afghanistan, or Turkmenistan. The Avesta, the Zoroastrian scripture, mentions place names that scholars have attempted to identify with varying degrees of success. There's mention of a river called the Daitya, possibly the modern Amu Darya. There's reference to regions that might correspond to ancient Bactria or Sogdiana. But we're working with fragmentary texts describing a geographical landscape that has changed considerably over 3 millennia, so precision is impossible. What we can say is this: Zarathustra likely lived in a pastoral, semi-nomadic society on the Iranian plateau, a world of cattle herders and small agricultural settlements, tribal structures, and constant low-level warfare between competing groups. This was not the sophisticated Persian Empire of Cyrus and Darius. That was still centuries in the future. This was a Bronze Age world, harsh and unforgiving, where survival depended on your livestock, your ability to defend them, and the favor of the gods. Speaking of gods, the religious landscape into which Zarathustra was born was polytheistic, featuring numerous deities called Daivas and Ahuras. These were nature deities, primarily associated with various aspects of the world: storm, war, fertility, the sun, the moon. Ritual practice involved animal sacrifice, particularly of cattle, and probably the use of haoma, an intoxicating drink pressed from a plant that scholars have variously identified as everything from ephedra to cannabis to some species of mushroom. Religious life was managed by a priestly class who performed these sacrifices and maintained the relationship between the human community and the divine powers. Into this world, Zarathustra was born. According to later Zoroastrian tradition, his birth was surrounded by miracles and portents. His mother, Dugdova, supposedly carried him with such radiance that she glowed. At his birth, he laughed instead of crying, which would be deeply unsettling if you witnessed it in real life, but in hagiography indicates special divine favor. Evil spirits fled from his presence, the usual array of miraculous claims that accumulate around religious founders. In reality, he was probably born into a priestly family. His name, Zarathustra, possibly means something like possessing old camels, or with golden camels, suggesting his family had wealth in livestock. The fact that he clearly received extensive training in the traditional priestly arts, he knew the hymns, the rituals, the theology, indicates he wasn't from a poor background. He was educated, intellectually capable, and deeply engaged with the religious questions of his time. His early life, we can assume, followed the pattern typical for someone in his position. He would have learned the traditional hymns and prayers. He would have studied the ritual procedures for sacrifice. He would have memorized the genealogies of the gods, their relationships, their spheres of influence. He would have learned to prepare haoma, to slaughter animals correctly, to read omens and signs. He was being trained to be a priest in the traditional mold, a maintainer of the established religious order. And then, at some point, probably in his late 20s or early 30s, something changed. He began having visions. The Gathas, those hymns I mentioned earlier, describe Zarathustra's encounter with the divine in various ways. The most famous account describes him participating in a spring festival, possibly involved in preparing haoma or performing some ritual by a river, when he had a vision of a luminous figure. This figure, according to the later tradition, was Vohumana, good mind, one of the Amesha Spentas, the holy immortals who serve Ahura Mazda. Vohumana led Zarathustra into the presence of Ahura Mazda himself, the wise lord, the supreme deity, and there, in this divine presence, Zarathustra received a revelation that would transform not just his own life, but the entire religious landscape of ancient Iran and, eventually, influence Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in ways scholars are still debating. What was this revelation? At its core, it was radical monotheism. Ahura Mazda was not simply the chief god among many gods. He was the supreme creator, the source of all that was good and true and orderly in the universe. The other gods, the Daivas, were not legitimate deities at all. They were demons, evil spirits, representatives of Druj, falsehood, and chaos. To worship them was not simply to choose different gods. It was to actively side with evil against good. Now, appreciate how revolutionary this was. Zarathustra was essentially telling everyone in his society that their entire religious framework was not just wrong, but morally corrupted. The priests who performed sacrifices to the Daivas, they were serving evil. The nobles who patronized these ceremonies, they were supporting chaos. The rituals that had been performed for generations, that gave structure and meaning to people's lives, all of it was in service to the wrong side of a cosmic battle. This did not go over well. The Gathas record Zarathustra's struggles with rejection and opposition. He complains about persecution. He describes his message being rejected by leaders and priests. He speaks of having to flee, of being driven from his community. At one point, he asks Ahura Mazda directly when he will finally receive support for his mission, the kind of plaintive question that suggests things were not going smoothly. For years, apparently, Zarathustra wandered, preaching his new theology, gaining few converts, facing active hostility from the established priestly class who correctly recognized him as a threat to their authority and livelihood. Imagine the situation from their perspective. Here's this priest, trained in all the traditional ways, who suddenly declares that everything they've been doing is evil, that the gods they serve are demons, that the entire sacrificial system is corrupt. They would have viewed him, quite reasonably from their standpoint, as a dangerous heretic and quite possibly insane. Zarathustra was not, it must be said, particularly diplomatic about his message. The Gathas contain some fairly blistering denunciations of his opponents. He calls them followers of the Druj, servants of falsehood. He prophesies their downfall and punishment. He's absolutely certain of his revelation and absolutely unwilling to compromise or soften his message for the sake of social harmony. This is admirable from a certain standpoint. He had the courage of his convictions, but it's not a strategy optimized for rapid religious conversion. His breakthrough came when he managed to convert a nobleman named Vishtaspa. Now, this is not the same Vishtaspa who was the father of Darius the Great. That's a later figure with the same name, which is confusing but typical of ancient history. This Vishtaspa was a local ruler, a Kavi, or king of some region on the eastern Iranian plateau. The details of his conversion are unclear, but it was the turning point in Zarathustra's mission. With royal patronage, everything changed. Suddenly, Zarathustra had protection, resources, and the ability to spread his message without fear of persecution. Vishtaspa, according to the tradition, became a zealous supporter of the new faith, providing Zarathustra with a base from which to operate and converting many of his own people. The Gathas suggest Zarathustra married and had children, living out his later years teaching, composing hymns, and establishing the practices that would become Zoroastrianism. The later traditions say he married 3 times and had multiple children, including both sons and daughters, some of whom became important figures in the early Zoroastrian community. What was daily life like for Zarathustra during these later successful years? We can piece together something of a picture. He would have spent considerable time in prayer and worship, addressing Ahura Mazda directly in the intimate, almost conversational way that characterizes the Gathas. These are not formal liturgies in the way later Zoroastrian texts are formal. They're passionate, poetic addresses to the divine, full of questions, praise, requests for understanding and support. He would have taught disciples, training a new generation of priests in the correct way to worship Ahura Mazda, the correct understanding of Asha and Druj, the moral and ritual requirements of the faith. This was not simply theological instruction. Zarathustra was creating an entirely new religious culture, defining how prayers should be said, how fire should be honored, not worshipped, but honored as a symbol of Ahura Mazda's truth and purity, how the community should organize itself ethically. Central to his teaching was the concept of free will and moral choice. This was another revolutionary aspect of Zarathustra's theology. Human beings, he taught, had the ability and responsibility to choose between Asha and Druj, between truth and falsehood, between good and evil. The universe was a battleground between these forces, and every human action contributed to one side or the other. You couldn't remain neutral. You couldn't simply perform the correct rituals without moral consideration. You had to actively choose good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, the famous Zoroastrian ethical triad. This emphasis on individual moral responsibility, on the cosmic significance of human choice, was remarkably modern in its sensibility. Later religious traditions, particularly Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, would develop similar concepts, and scholars have long debated whether and how much Zoroastrianism influenced these later developments. During the Babylonian exile, for instance, Jews would have had extensive contact with Zoroastrian ideas and some of the concepts that appear in later Jewish thought: apocalyptic visions, the final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, the figure of Satan as a cosmic opponent to God, have striking parallels in Zoroastrianism. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Zarathustra himself, in his lifetime, was focused on much more immediate concerns. He was building a community, establishing practices, defending his theology against both external opponents and internal misunderstandings. The later tradition records theological discussions and debates, though how much of this material actually goes back to Zarathustra himself versus being later elaborations is, like everything else about him, uncertain. One of the distinctive aspects of Zarathustra's teaching was his attitude toward traditional practices like animal sacrifice. He didn't entirely eliminate sacrifice, but he radically reframed it. The important thing was not the physical act of killing an animal and offering it to the gods. That was the old way, the way of the Deva worshippers. The important thing was the inner spiritual state of the worshipper, the ethical life that made the offering meaningful. A person living a life of Asha, of truth and righteousness, offering a sacrifice with proper understanding and devotion to Ahura Mazda. That was acceptable. The same physical act performed by someone serving Druj, performed out of ignorance or for the wrong deities was worthless or actively harmful. This internalization of religion, this emphasis on ethical intent over ritual correctness alone, was another way in which Zarathustra's thought anticipated later religious developments. Not that he rejected ritual. Zoroastrianism would develop extremely elaborate ritual practices, as we discussed in the first segment. But the ritual was supposed to express and reinforce an ethical commitment, not replace it. Fire became central to Zoroastrian practice under Zarathustra's influence, though probably not in the fully developed form we see in later centuries with the fire temples. Fire represented Asha. It was pure. It transformed things. It provided light and heat. It rose upward toward the heavens. To maintain fire, to keep it pure and burning, became a symbol of maintaining truth and righteousness in the world. You can see how this would eventually develop into the elaborate fire-keeping practices we discussed earlier, though that development probably took place over several centuries after Zarathustra's death. How did Zarathustra die? The tradition says he was killed at age 77 while praying before a fire altar, murdered by opponents of his religion. This has a satisfying martyrdom narrative quality to it. The prophet slain while in the act of worship, dying for his faith. Whether it's historically accurate is, of course, unknowable. He may have died peacefully in old age. He may have died of disease. The martyrdom story might be later embellishment designed to give his death the kind of dramatic significance that befits a religious founder. What we can say is that his religious movement survived him. His teachings were preserved, initially through oral transmission. The Gathas were memorized and recited by generations of priests long before they were written down. The Avesta, the Zoroastrian scripture, contains the Gathas as its oldest and most sacred core, surrounded by later texts and commentaries that elaborate and systematize Zarathustra's original insights. The religion spread. From its origins on the eastern Iranian plateau, it moved westward, eventually becoming the state religion of the Persian Empire under the Achaemenid dynasty. Though scholars debate how much the Achaemenid religion actually resembled Zarathustra's original teachings versus being a synthesis of his ideas with older Iranian traditions. Later, under the Sasanian Empire, Zoroastrianism was definitively established as the state religion, with an elaborate clerical hierarchy, extensive theological literature, and exactly the kind of complex ritual purity systems that would have made fire temple keeping such a demanding occupation. Zarathustra himself, the historical figure, remains elusive. We have his hymns, or at least hymns attributed to him. We have later traditions about his life, though how much of these reflect actual historical memory versus pious elaboration is impossible to determine. We have the religion he founded, or at least inspired, though it evolved considerably in the centuries after his death. What comes through in the Gathas, though, is a personality, passionate, certain, uncompromising, deeply spiritual, intellectually sophisticated. These are the words of someone who had a profound religious experience and spent the rest of his life trying to communicate it, to build a framework around it, to convince others of its truth. Whether you believe he actually encountered Ahura Mazda or experienced some kind of psychological or neurological event that he interpreted as divine revelation, the sincerity is palpable. There's something almost modern about Zarathustra's religious sensibility, his emphasis on individual moral choice, his internalization of religious life, his monotheism. And yet he lived 3,000 years ago in a world utterly different from ours, facing challenges we can barely imagine. He was a Bronze Age prophet whose ideas somehow survived the collapse of civilizations, the conquest of his homeland by Greeks and Arabs, the conversion of most of his followers to Islam, and the passage of countless centuries. Small communities of Zoroastrians still exist today, primarily in India, where they're known as Parsis, and in Iran, where they're a tiny minority, maintaining their ancient traditions. They still recite versions of Zarathustra's hymns. They still honor fire as a symbol of the divine. They still commit themselves to good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. The religion has changed enormously over 3 millennia, of course, but there's a thread of continuity running from Zarathustra's original revelation to modern practice. Imagine living a life so committed to an idea, a vision, a religious truth, that 3,000 years later, people are still organizing their lives around it. That's Zarathustra's achievement, not the building of an empire. He never had political power beyond what his royal patron provided, not the writing of an extensive scripture. His authentic works are relatively brief, just 17 hymns. His achievement was having an idea profound and compelling enough to change how people thought about the divine, about human responsibility, about the structure of the cosmos itself. And all of this from a priest who had some visions by a river, was rejected by his community, wandered for years preaching a message almost no one wanted to hear, finally found a patron willing to support him, and spent the rest of his life building a religious tradition that would outlast empires. There's something rather beautiful about that in its way. The persistence of ideas, the power of conviction, the strange durability of human attempts to understand the divine and our place in the cosmic order. Zarathustra lived and died, probably sometime around 3,000 years ago, probably somewhere on the Iranian plateau, probably after a life of struggle and eventual success in establishing his religious vision. The fires he honored as symbols of truth are still burning in temples maintained by priests who trace their tradition back to his teaching. That's about as close to immortality as a human being gets. Not that you'd want to tend those fires yourself, as we've established, but you can appreciate the man who inspired the practice while being deeply grateful you don't have to actually do it. Now, we arrive at one of the most fascinating, most unusual, and most frequently misunderstood aspects of Zoroastrianism, what they did with their dead. And I say did rather than do, because while some traditional communities maintain these practices into the 20th century, they've largely ceased, for reasons we'll discuss. But for roughly 2,000 years, Zoroastrians dealt with death in a way that seems, to modern sensibilities, either brilliantly practical or deeply disturbing, depending on your perspective and possibly your tolerance for birds. Let me set the theological stage first, because Zoroastrian funerary practices don't make sense without understanding their underlying beliefs about death and purity. We've already discussed the central importance of purity in Zoroastrianism, how fire temple keepers had to maintain constant ritual cleanliness, how contamination was a perpetual concern. Well, nothing was more contaminating, more fundamentally impure than a corpse. This wasn't simply squeamishness or superstition. In Zoroastrian theology, death was the work of Angra Mainyu, the evil spirit, the opponent of Ahura Mazda. When a person died, a corpse demon called a Druji Nasush, a demon of corruption, entered the body immediately. The corpse was not simply dead organic matter. It was actively possessed by evil, radiating spiritual pollution that could contaminate anything it touched. Think about the implications. If you're a Zoroastrian and someone in your family dies, you're now dealing with what is essentially a spiritually radioactive object in your home. It cannot be allowed to touch the earth, because the earth is sacred, created by Ahura Mazda, and contaminating it with a corpse would be a terrible pollution. It cannot be burned, because fire is the most sacred element, the symbol of Ahura Mazda's truth, and you absolutely cannot pollute fire with dead matter. That would be an almost incomprehensible sacrilege. It cannot be buried at sea or thrown in a river, because water, too, is sacred and must not be contaminated. So what do? You can't keep it in your house. The contamination is spreading every moment. You can't bury it, burn it, or throw it in water. The Zoroastrians developed what was, from a certain perspective, a brilliantly logical solution. You let nature dispose of it in a way that doesn't contaminate the sacred elements. Specifically, you feed it to birds. Welcome to the Dakma, known in English as the Tower of Silence. Picture a circular stone structure, generally built on elevated ground, sometimes on a hilltop, deliberately isolated from populated areas. The tower's walls are perhaps 15 to 20 feet high, thick stone with a single entrance door. The interior is open to the sky. No roof, just open air. The floor is divided into 3 concentric rings with a central pit. The outermost ring is for men's corpses. The middle ring is for women's corpses. The inner ring is for children's corpses. Everything slopes gently downward toward the central pit. When someone died, their body would be washed and clothed in simple white garments, usually old and worn clothing because you weren't going to use good fabric for this purpose. It would be contaminated immediately. The body could not be touched directly by living people without those people becoming contaminated themselves. So special corpse bearers, called nasasalers, would handle the body. These were individuals who had specifically taken on this role, accepting the ritual impurity it entailed, because someone had to do it. The nasasalers worked in pairs, carrying the corpse on an iron bier. Iron was used because it was considered resistant to the corruption of the corpse demon, a bit of material magic incorporated into the theology. They would process from the home to the dakma, often followed at a considerable distance by mourners who had to be careful not to come too close to the corpse or the bearers carrying it. Even grief had to be managed within the constraints of purity law. At the dakma, the nasasalers would carry the body up and through the entrance. Inside, they would place it in the appropriate ring, outer for men, middle for women, inner for children, and arrange it properly. The body would be laid out exposed to the elements, unadorned, completely vulnerable. And then they would leave. They would seal the entrance. And they would wait. The vultures, you see, were already there. Towers of silence were positioned specifically in locations where vulture populations were healthy and active. The birds had learned over generations that these structures meant food. They would circle, they would land on the walls, they would wait. And once the nasasalers left and sealed the entrance, the birds would descend. Now, this is where I need to be somewhat delicate, because what happened next is a natural process that is also quite gruesome if described in detail. The vultures would consume the soft tissues of the corpse. They were remarkably efficient at this task. Within a few hours, sometimes within an hour or 2 if the vulture population was large enough and hungry enough, the body would be reduced to bones. Just bones, picked completely clean, white and bare under the sun. From a Zoroastrian theological perspective, this was ideal. The corpse was being disposed of without contaminating earth, water, or fire. The birds were doing what birds do. They're scavengers. This is their ecological role. No sacred element was being polluted. The demon of corruption had nothing left to possess, and the process was remarkably quick and efficient. The bones would remain in their ring, bleaching in the sun. Sun and rain and wind would do their work over the following months, further purifying what remained, breaking down anything the birds had left. Eventually, usually after about a year, the bones would be swept into the central pit. There, they would gradually decompose into dust, filtering down through holes in the bottom of the pit, becoming part of the earth in a gradual, natural way that was considered acceptable since the flesh, the most impure part, had already been removed by the birds. Let's talk about what this experience would have been like for the family, for the mourners, because this is where the practice becomes emotionally complex in ways the theological explanation doesn't quite capture. You've just lost someone you love, your father, perhaps, or your wife, or your child. The grief is immediate, overwhelming, the same grief humans have always felt in the face of death. But you cannot touch the body. You cannot prepare it yourself. You have to step back and let the necessallers handle everything, because if you touch a corpse, you become contaminated, requiring extensive purification rituals that could take days. You follow the procession to the Tower of Silence at a distance. You cannot get too close. You watch the necessallers carry your loved one through that entrance. And then they come back out, seal the door, and it's done. You know what's happening inside, even though you cannot see it. You know the birds are descending. You know the body of the person you loved is being torn apart and consumed. How does that feel? The sources don't really tell us, because Zoroastrian texts are much more concerned with proper ritual procedure than with documenting emotional experiences. But we can imagine. Some people probably found comfort in the theological framework. Their loved one's body was being disposed of in the correct manner, preventing pollution, maintaining cosmic order. The person's soul, their urvan, had already departed for judgment before Ahura Mazda. What remained was just corrupted matter that needed to be handled properly. Others might have found it horrifying, despite the theology, despite understanding intellectually why it was necessary. There's something viscerally disturbing about the image of birds consuming someone you loved, even if you know it's theologically correct, even if you understand the reasoning. Grief doesn't always respond well to theological arguments. The period of mourning had its own complex rules. The family would be in a state of contamination for a time, requiring purification. There were prayers to be said, ceremonies to be performed. On the fourth day after death, according to Zoroastrian belief, the soul would cross the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of judgment, where its deeds would be weighed. Good souls would cross easily into paradise. Evil souls would fall into hell. Those in between would go to a middle place, neither blessed nor damned, waiting for the final renovation of the world. The family would pray for the soul during this time, would perform ceremonies to help it on its journey. Food offerings might be made, though not to the deceased. Zoroastrians didn't believe in feeding the dead. The offerings were for the living, to be shared among the community as part of the mourning process, reinforcing social bonds at a time of loss. After a year, when the bones were swept into the central pit, there might be a final ceremony, a closing ritual that marked the end of the mourning period and the final disposition of the physical remains. Life would go on. The family would return to their normal activities. The Yule deceased would be remembered in prayers, particularly during specific festivals dedicated to remembering the dead. but the intense mourning period was over. Now, let's discuss some of the mysteries and questions that surround this practice, because despite seeming straightforward in principle, there are aspects we don't fully understand. First, when did this practice actually begin? The Towers of Silence. As architectural structures seem to appear in the historical and archaeological record relatively late, mostly in the Sasanian period and later, starting around the 3rd to 7th centuries CE. But the practice of excarnation, exposing corpses to birds and animals rather than burying them, may be considerably older. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE about Persian customs, mentions that corpses were exposed to birds or dogs before burial, though he's frustratingly vague on the details and may have misunderstood what he was told. The problem is that excarnation doesn't leave much archaeological evidence. If you're exposing bodies in the open or in temporary structures, there's nothing permanent to find. Burial leaves graves. Cremation leaves ash deposits or urns. Excarnation leaves almost nothing, especially if the bones were eventually scattered or buried after defleshing. So, we can't definitively say when the practice began, only that by the Sasanian period it was well established and had the architectural form of the dakma. Second, how universal was this practice? We know it was standard in Persia and among Zoroastrian communities that maintained close ties to Persian traditions. But Zoroastrianism spread across a wide area, from the Mediterranean to Central Asia to India. Did all these communities use excarnation? The evidence suggests variation. Some communities, particularly those living in areas without reliable vulture populations, may have used different methods. There are hints in the sources of bodies being exposed in remote places, or in special enclosed areas, or of other adaptations. When Zoroastrians fled to India after the Arab conquest of Persia in the 7th century CE, establishing the Parsi community, they brought the practice with them. The Parsis built Towers of Silence in India, most famously in Bombay, now Mumbai, and continued the practice for well over 1,000 years. The towers in Bombay on Malabar Hill became iconic, a symbol of Parsi identity and religious distinctiveness. But in the late 20th century, the practice began to fail, and this brings us to one of the most poignant aspects of the entire story. Vulture populations in India underwent catastrophic decline starting in the 1990s. The cause was eventually identified as diclofenac, a veterinary drug used to treat livestock. When cattle treated with diclofenac died and were left for scavengers, vultures feeding on the carcasses were poisoned. The drug caused kidney failure in the birds, and vulture populations dropped by over 95% in just a few years. Suddenly, the Towers of Silence stopped working. There weren't enough vultures. Bodies would lie in the towers for days, weeks, decomposing slowly in the heat rather than being quickly excarnated. The system that had functioned for over 1,000 years was broken by modern veterinary medicine's accidental impact on bird populations. The Parsi community faced a crisis. Some argued for maintaining the traditional practice despite its inefficiency, out of religious fidelity. Others advocated for modifications, solar concentrators to speed decomposition, or even abandoning the towers entirely for burial or cremation. The debates were intense, because this was about more than practical disposal of the dead. It was about identity, tradition, religious correctness, and adaptation to modern circumstances. Different communities made different choices. Some still maintain the towers, but have had to adapt to the scarcity of vultures. sometimes using other methods to speed decomposition. Others have moved to cremation, despite the theological problems this creates. Still others use burial, with careful rituals to minimize the contamination of the earth. The ancient practice has been forced to evolve or be abandoned entirely, victim of ecological catastrophe caused by modern industrial agriculture. There's something deeply ironic about this. A practice that survived for thousands of years, that endured through the fall of empires, through religious persecution, through countless social and political changes, was ultimately defeated by a veterinary drug meant to reduce suffering in cattle. The towers stand empty now, or mostly empty, monuments to a practice that made perfect sense within its theological framework but couldn't survive the unintended consequences of modernity. Let's consider what archaeologists and historians have been able to learn from the towers that remain. The structures themselves are quite sophisticated architecturally. The careful engineering of the drainage, sloping everything toward the central pit, shows considerable thought. The three rings, maintaining separation between men, women, and children, even in death, reflects the social hierarchies and gender distinctions of the culture. The positioning of the towers, always in isolated locations, always elevated, shows careful site selection balancing practical needs, vulture access, distance from population centers, with religious requirements, avoiding contamination of the surroundings. Inside some towers, archaeologists have found bones, though usually not many. The whole point was that bones eventually disintegrated into dust. But occasionally, in abandoned towers, accumulations of bone fragments can be found and studied. These provide some information about the populations that use the towers, about disease patterns, about life expectancy, about diet and health. It's fragmentary evidence, but it's something. The towers also tell us about religious continuity and community identity. Building a tower of silence was a significant investment, requiring substantial resources and skilled labor. Communities built them as permanent structures meant to serve for generations. The existence of a tower marked a community as Zoroastrian, as maintaining the old ways, as committed to purity, even when it required unusual and sometimes difficult practices. One of the questions that fascinates scholars is what happened to Zoroastrian burial practices in the diaspora, in communities that found themselves in areas where towers weren't practical, or where local authorities forbade them. There's evidence of adaptation, of communities finding ways to maintain the spirit of the practice, if not the exact form. Some used catacombs or stone-lined chambers where bodies could be isolated from direct earth contact. Others developed elaborate purification rituals to make burial acceptable despite the theological problems. This adaptive capacity, this ability to maintain religious identity while adjusting to practical constraints, is part of how Zoroastrianism survived as a minority religion for over 1,000 years after losing political power. The practices were never quite as rigid as the theological texts suggest they should be. There was always some room for interpretation, for adjustment, for practical accommodation, even while maintaining commitment to core principles. The emotional and psychological dimensions of excarnation remain somewhat mysterious to us. We have the ritual texts, the theological explanations, the architectural evidence. What we don't have are personal accounts, diaries, letters describing how people actually felt about this practice. Did they find it comforting? Disturbing? Did familiarity make it routine? Or did every funeral involve a fresh confrontation with the visceral reality of death and decomposition? We can make some inferences. The practice continued for centuries, which suggests people found it acceptable, even appropriate. If it had been psychologically intolerable, communities would have found ways to modify or abandon it. Theological commitments notwithstanding, the fact that Parsi communities in India maintained the practice right up until vulture populations collapsed suggests it remained meaningful, not just tolerated, but actively valued as part of religious identity. There's also something remarkably ecological about the practice, though the Zoroastrians wouldn't have used that language. The body returns to the natural cycle through the vultures, feeding the birds that are themselves part of the ecosystem. Nothing is wasted. There's no casket slowly decomposing underground, no burial plot taking up land in perpetuity, no cremation requiring massive amounts of fuel. From a modern environmental perspective, it's arguably more sustainable than most current disposal methods, which is an odd thing to say about an ancient religious practice, but nonetheless true. The towers themselves, the ones that still stand, are haunting places. Many are now protected as historical sites, no longer in active use, slowly weathering in the sun and rain that once helped purify the bones they contained. You can visit some of them, though out of respect for the religious significance, access is often restricted. Standing outside one of these circular stone structures, knowing what it was used for, understanding the theology behind it, there's a strange mixture of admiration and discomfort. Admiration for the logical consistency of the practice within its theological framework. If you accept the premises about purity and contamination, the solution makes sense. Admiration for the communities that maintained this practice for so long, that built these structures, that preserved their religious identity through political upheaval and social pressure. But also discomfort, because no matter how much we intellectually understand the reasoning, there's something viscerally challenging about the image of human bodies being consumed by birds, even if we know it's a natural process, even if we know the person is dead and beyond caring what happens to their physical remains. Perhaps that discomfort is itself instructive. It reminds us how much our attitudes toward death, toward the body, toward proper treatment of the dead, are culturally constructed. What seems obviously correct to one culture, burying bodies in coffins in consecrated ground, for instance, would seem bizarre or even horrifying to another. The Zoroastrians had their towers and their vultures. We have our cemeteries and our funeral homes and our crematoriums. Future generations might find our practices equally strange, equally in need of explanation and contextualization. The mystery of Zoroastrian funerary practices isn't really a mystery in the sense of being unsolved. We understand the theology. We understand the practice. We have the architectural evidence. What remains mysterious, perhaps permanently so, is the lived experience, the emotional and psychological reality of participating in these rituals, of growing up in a culture where this was normal, where saying goodbye to your loved ones meant watching them carried into a tower to be consumed by birds. The towers stand in silence now, mostly empty, monuments to a practice that made perfect sense for thousands of years, and then, quite suddenly, became impossible to maintain. The vultures that once performed their sacred ecological function are gone, victims of veterinary medicine. The communities have adapted, finding new ways to dispose of their dead, new interpretations of purity that accommodate modern circumstances. But the towers remain, circular stone structures open to the sky, reminding us that humans have found countless ways to confront mortality, to make sense of death, to dispose of our dead with dignity and religious meaning. The Zoroastrians built their towers and let the birds do what birds do, trusting in the natural order they believed was created by Ahura Mazda, maintaining purity even in death, keeping the sacred elements uncontaminated through practices that required both theological sophistication and practical courage. You wouldn't have lasted a day as a fire temple keeper, as we established. But could you have participated in these funerary rites? Could you have stood at a distance and watched the Nasasalers carry your loved one into the tower, knowing what would happen next? Finding peace in the theological framework even as grief overwhelmed you. It's worth contemplating, there in the darkness, as you drift towards sleep. The different ways humans have confronted the universal fact of death. The remarkable diversity of practices we've developed. The courage it takes to maintain faith in the face of loss, to trust that there's meaning and order and rightness, even when someone you love has been reduced to bones in a tower, consumed by birds under an indifferent sky. The towers are silent now. The vultures are gone. But the questions remain, eternal as human mortality itself, waiting patiently for each generation to discover them anew. We've spent considerable time discussing the demanding life of fire temple keepers, the visionary founder of the religion, and the unusual disposal of the dead. Now, let's turn our attention to the broader priestly class in ancient Persia, to understand who these people were, how they accumulated and maintained power, what their lives actually looked like, and how they managed to position themselves as absolutely essential intermediaries between the divine and the ordinary people who, quite frankly, had enough trouble just surviving without worrying about the complexities of ritual purity. The Zoroastrian priestly class, known collectively as the Magi. Yes, that's where the word magic comes from, which should tell you something about how Greeks and Romans viewed these priests, occupied a fascinating position in Persian society. They were simultaneously servants of the divine order, political advisors, ritual specialists, guardians of sacred knowledge, and, in some cases, extraordinarily wealthy landowners. This is quite an impressive range of roles for people whose primary qualification was knowing how to recite prayers in a dead language and maintain fires without contaminating them. Let's start with the structure of the priesthood itself, because like all successful religious hierarchies, it was carefully organized to ensure proper authority flows downward and proper deference flows upward. At the top were the Magi proper, the high priests, the specialists in theology and ritual, who could trace their lineage back through generations of priestly families. Becoming a magus wasn't something you decided to do on a whim. You were generally born into it. Priestly knowledge was hereditary, passed from father to son, occasionally uncle to nephew, kept carefully within families that had maintained these traditions for centuries. This hereditary system had obvious advantages. It ensured continuity of knowledge. It created families with deep investment in maintaining priestly authority and prestige. It meant young priests grew up saturated in religious culture, learning prayers and rituals from earliest childhood, developing the kind of instinctive understanding of liturgical practice that takes decades to cultivate. It also meant that priestly positions were essentially monopolized by a small number of families who had every incentive to keep outsiders out and to maintain the mystique and complexity of their knowledge. Why simplify rituals when complexity ensures you remain indispensable? Why translate sacred texts into common language when keeping them in archaic Avestan guarantees that ordinary people need you to interpret for them? Below the high priests were various ranks of lesser priests and temple servants. The Herbads were lower-ranking priests who had completed basic training, but hadn't achieved the full knowledge and authority of the Magi. They might conduct simpler ceremonies, assist in rituals, teach students, maintain temple facilities, all the necessary but less prestigious work that keeps a religious institution functioning. Then, there were the fire keepers we've already discussed, the Nasasalers who handled corpses, and various other specialists who performed specific ritual functions. The whole system was hierarchical, with clear gradations of authority, knowledge, and prestige. You knew where you stood. You knew who was above you and who was below you. This is comforting in a way. Everyone has a defined role, a clear place in the social order. Of course, if you happen to be born into a lower position, you might find it less comforting and more oppressive. But that's hierarchy for you. The training to become a priest was extensive and began young. If you were born into a priestly family, your education would start in childhood, probably around age 7 or 8. You would begin by learning basic prayers, memorizing them in Avestan, even though you didn't yet understand what the words meant. Ancient language acquisition, through rote repetition, every child's dream educational experience. You would learn the proper pronunciation, the proper intonation, the proper rhythm. This was crucial because prayers had to be recited correctly or they were ineffective. A mispronounced prayer was worse than no prayer at all. It showed disrespect to Ahura Mazda and might even be dangerous, invoking divine powers improperly. So you practiced endlessly until the prayers were so deeply embedded in your memory that you could recite them in your sleep, which, given the length of some ceremonies, you might occasionally actually do. As you grew older, you would learn the meanings of what you'd been reciting. The theology would be explained. You would study the Avesta, the sacred texts, learning to interpret them correctly, understanding the layers of meaning, the theological principles, the cosmological framework. You would learn about Asha and Druj, about the Ameshaspentas, about the structure of creation, and the eventual renovation of the world when good would finally triumph over evil. You would also learn practical skills: how to maintain fire correctly, how to perform purification rituals, how to prepare the barsum, the bundle of sacred twigs used in ceremonies, how to handle sacred implements without contaminating them, how to conduct weddings, funerals, seasonal festivals, how to give blessings, how to accept offerings, how to deal with people who came to the temple seeking divine favor or guidance. This education might take 10, 15, even 20 years before you were considered fully qualified to serve as a priest independently. By the time you completed your training, you would be utterly saturated in Zoroastrian religious culture. You would think in theological categories. You would instinctively assess situations in terms of purity and contamination. You would see the entire world through the lens of the cosmic battle between Asha and Druj. This was intentional. The training wasn't just about knowledge transfer. It was about socialization, about creating a particular kind of person who could serve as an effective intermediary between the divine and the ordinary. You needed to be different from ordinary people, set apart, recognizably priestly in your demeanor and perspective. Let's talk about what daily life looked like for a priest who wasn't specifically a fire temple keeper, someone who served a community, conducted ceremonies, advised on religious matters, but didn't live in the isolated, intensely ritualized existence we described earlier. You would wake early, not quite as early as the fire keepers perhaps, but still before most of the community. Morning prayers were essential, aligning yourself with Asha at the start of each day, reaffirming your commitment to truth and order. You would perform your ablutions, dress in your priestly garments, white, generally symbolizing purity, and prepare for the day's duties. If there were ceremonies scheduled, you would prepare for them. Weddings, for instance, were important sources of priestly income and required careful ritual preparation. You would need to ensure you were in a state of purity, that all the necessary implements were ready, that the sacred fire was properly maintained, that you had prepared whatever offerings or libations were required. The wedding ceremony itself would be lengthy and complex. You would recite prayers in Avestan, prayers the bride and groom likely didn't understand, but trusted were appropriate and effective. You would bind their hands with a sacred cord, symbolizing their union. You would make offerings to fire, to water, to the other sacred elements. You would give blessings for fertility, prosperity, long life, and protection from evil. The family would pay you for this service, of course. Exactly how much depended on their wealth and generosity, but performing ceremonies was a significant source of priestly income. The wealthy might pay handsomely for elaborate ceremonies with multiple priests, extensive prayers, and significant offerings. The poor might pay what they could, and you would perform a simpler ceremony, but still valid, still effective. After the wedding, you might have other obligations. Perhaps a family needed prayers said for a deceased relative. Perhaps someone was ill and sought blessings for healing. Perhaps a merchant was beginning a long journey and wanted divine protection. Perhaps a farmer was concerned about his crops and needed a priest to perform rituals to ensure good harvest. All of these services required your specialized knowledge. You knew the correct prayers for each situation. You knew which ameshaspentas to invoke for which purposes. You knew how to perform the rituals correctly, how to make the offerings, how to ensure divine favor. Or at least, you knew how to perform rituals that everyone believed would ensure divine favor, which, from a social perspective, amounts to the same thing. You were also a repository of knowledge beyond the purely religious. Priests were among the few literate members of society in ancient Persia. You could read and write, skills that were not universal among the population. This made you valuable for practical purposes beyond conducting ceremonies. You might help draft contracts, record transactions, write letters for those who couldn't write themselves, maintain temple records. You would also serve as an advisor on matters of religious law and purity. If someone was uncertain whether a particular action was permissible, they would consult you. If there was a dispute about inheritance or marriage arrangements that had religious dimensions, you might be asked to arbitrate or at least provide guidance. If someone had become contaminated and needed to be purified, you would instruct them on the correct procedures. This advisory role gave you considerable social influence. People depended on your expertise. They needed you to navigate the complex system of religious obligations and prohibitions that governed their lives. And because Zoroastrianism integrated religious law so thoroughly with daily life, your religious authority translated into practical power over many aspects of how people lived. Let's discuss the economic position of priests, because this is where things become quite interesting. The priesthood was not uniformly wealthy, but the higher ranks could accumulate substantial resources through several mechanisms. First, there were the fees for ceremonies. Every wedding, every funeral, every festival, every blessing, every purification ritual, all of these generated income. For a successful priest serving a prosperous community, these fees could be substantial. You weren't simply scraping by. You might live quite comfortably. Second, there were offerings made to temples, the pious would donate money, goods, or land to ensure divine favor or fulfill vows. These offerings technically belonged to the temple, but the priests who managed the temple controlled how these resources were used. There was obviously potential for, shall we say, creative accounting that benefited the priests personally. Third, temples often owned land. Sometimes this land was donated, sometimes it was purchased with temple funds, sometimes it was granted by rulers who sought divine favor or wanted to support the religious establishment. Either way, temples became landowners, and the priests managed these estates, collected rents from tenants, and benefited from agricultural production. The wealthiest temples, particularly the great fire temples in major cities, controlled enormous resources. They owned vast estates, employed hundreds of people, maintained extensive buildings and facilities, and functioned essentially as major economic institutions. The high priests who managed these temples wielded power and influence that went far beyond the purely spiritual. This created an obvious problem. Priests, who were supposed to be focused on maintaining purity and serving Ahura Mazda, were also landlords, managers, political operators, and economic power brokers. The tension between spiritual ideals and worldly realities was palpable, though rarely openly acknowledged in the sources that survive. Some priests undoubtedly navigated this tension successfully, maintaining genuine piety, while also managing practical responsibilities. Others probably became more interested in wealth and power than in spiritual matters, using their priestly position primarily as a source of privilege and income. The historical record doesn't give us detailed character studies, but we can infer from the general pattern of religious institutions throughout history that both types existed. Now, let's talk about the relationship between the priestly class and political authority, because this is crucial for understanding how priests maintained their position in society. In the Achaemenid Empire, the relationship between the Magi and the ruling dynasty was complex. The kings claimed divine favor and presented themselves as chosen by Ahura Mazda to rule. The Magi, as specialists in communicating with the divine, served as validators of this claim. If the priests declared that a king had Ahura Mazda's favor, this legitimated his rule in the eyes of the population. This gave priests significant political leverage. Kings needed their support, or at least their acquiescence. A king opposed by the priestly class would face serious legitimacy problems. Conversely, priests needed royal patronage. Kings provided protection, granted privileges, donated resources to temples, and enforced religious laws that maintained priestly authority. This created a mutually beneficial but also potentially fraught relationship. As long as both sides cooperated, the system worked well. Priests supported royal authority, kings supported priestly privilege, and ordinary people accepted the legitimacy of both. But if the relationship fractured, if a king tried to reduce priestly power, or if priests opposed a king's policies, the consequences could be severe for both sides. There's a famous incident recorded by Herodotus involving a magus named Gaumata, who apparently impersonated a member of the royal family and seized the throne after the death of Cambyses II. The story is complex and possibly propagandistic. Our sources are Persian aristocrats and later Greek historians, who had their own biases. But the interesting thing is that a priest could even attempt to claim royal power, which suggests the political significance of the priestly class. Darius I, who overthrew Gaumata and established himself as king, had to carefully manage his relationship with the Magi afterward. He needed their support, but couldn't appear to be dominated by them. The inscriptions he left, particularly the great Behistun inscription, emphasized his divine mandate directly from Ahura Mazda, presenting himself as chosen by the god without necessarily requiring priestly mediation. This pattern, kings claiming direct divine favor while also patronizing the priestly class that ostensibly mediated divine favor, persisted throughout Persian history. It created a delicate balance of power where neither side could completely dominate the other, but both needed each other to maintain their respective positions. Under the Sasanian Empire, centuries later, the relationship became more formalized. Zoroastrianism was officially the state religion, and there was a chief priest, the Mobadan Mobad, who held a position parallel in some ways to the king. The priestly hierarchy was elaborate, bureaucratized, and deeply integrated into the imperial administration. Priests served as judges, administrators, educators, and advisors throughout the empire. This was the high point of priestly power in ancient Persia, but it also created vulnerabilities. When the Sasanian Empire fell to the Arab conquest in the 7th century, the institutional structure that supported the priesthood collapsed. Without royal patronage, without official status, without the administrative positions that had provided income and influence, the priestly class had to dramatically downsize and adapt. The Zoroastrians who remained in Persia under Islamic rule lost most of their wealth, power, and prestige. Those who fled to India and established the Parsi community had to rebuild their religious institutions from scratch in a new land where they were refugees and minorities. The hereditary priestly families that had maintained their positions for centuries suddenly found themselves struggling to survive, let alone maintain their former glory. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to ancient Persia at its height, when the priestly class was secure, prosperous, and influential. Imagine you're a young priest from a good family, well-educated, properly trained, starting your career in a prosperous city. You have all the advantages your birth and education provide. You know the prayers. You understand the theology. You can perform ceremonies competently. What does your career path look like? You might start as an assistant to an older priest, helping with ceremonies, learning the practical aspects of temple administration, making connections with important families in the community. You would gradually build a reputation for competence and piety. You would perform marriages and funerals, conduct seasonal festivals, give blessings, offer advice on religious matters. If you're ambitious and capable, you might seek a position at a more important temple, perhaps in the capital, where the fees are higher and the opportunities for advancement greater. You would cultivate relationships with powerful patrons, nobles, merchants, officials, who could support your career and ensure you received the most lucrative ceremonial commissions. You might marry. Priests generally could marry, unlike the fire temple keepers who were often celibate, and have children. If you had sons, you would begin training them in the priestly arts, ensuring your family's position in the hereditary priestly class continued into the next generation. If you had daughters, you would arrange suitable marriages, possibly to other priestly families, strengthening your network of connections. Over the years, you might accumulate wealth, careful saving from ceremony fees, perhaps some successful investments or land purchases, maybe an inheritance from a relative. You could live quite comfortably, a nice house, servants, good food, fine clothing, not aristocratic luxury perhaps, but certainly far above the subsistence level of peasant farmers. In your middle years you might achieve significant positions. Perhaps you would be appointed to manage a temple, controlling its resources, supervising younger priests, conducting the most important ceremonies. Perhaps you would serve as an advisor to nobles or officials, using your religious expertise to influence policy decisions. Perhaps you would be recognized as a scholar, known for your deep understanding of theology or your skill in interpreting difficult passages of the Avesta. By the time you reached old age, you might be one of the respected elders of the priestly community, consulted on difficult questions, asked to teach the most promising students, honored for your years of service. Your sons would have established their own careers in the priesthood. Your family's position would be secure. You could look back on a life well lived according to the standards of your class and time. This, of course, assumes everything went well. But life in ancient Persia could be precarious even for privileged classes. Political upheavals could disrupt everything. A king who favored different priests or different policies could undermine your position. Economic disruptions could reduce your income. Disease could strike you or your family. War could devastate your city. Nothing was guaranteed. The priestly class, for all its privileges and power, was ultimately dependent on the broader social and political order. When that order was stable, priests thrived. When it was disrupted, priests suffered along with everyone else, and often suffered more because they had further to fall. There's something rather poignant about contemplating the lives of these ancient priests. They devoted themselves to maintaining eternal fires, preserving sacred knowledge, conducting rituals they believed were cosmically significant. They positioned themselves as intermediaries between humanity and the divine. They accumulated power, wealth, and influence based on their specialized religious knowledge. And then, eventually, their entire world collapsed. The empire fell. The religion was displaced by Islam. The fires went out or were maintained only by diminishing minority communities. The great temples were destroyed or converted to other uses. The hereditary priestly families either converted to Islam, fled to India, or struggled on as an increasingly marginalized minority in their homeland. All that knowledge, all that ritual precision, all that accumulated tradition, it persisted, but in dramatically reduced circumstances. The descendants of the Magi who had advised kings and managed vast temple estates found themselves as minorities struggling to maintain their religious identity in often hostile environments. Yet they did maintain it. The Zoroastrian priestly lineages continued, preserving their traditions, training new generations, keeping the fires burning, even when everything else had changed. There's something remarkable about that persistence, that refusal to simply abandon their heritage, even when it no longer brought power or wealth. The priestly families that fled to India established themselves as the Parsi community, and their descendants are still there today, still maintaining priestly lineages, still training in the ancient rituals, still reciting prayers in Avestan that their ancestors recited 3,000 years ago in ancient Persia. The knowledge has been passed down, father to son, generation after generation, through empires and exiles and centuries of change. That's the real achievement of the priestly class, perhaps more significant than all the political power and wealth they accumulated at their height. They created an institutional framework and a system of knowledge transmission robust enough to survive the collapse of the civilization that originally supported them. They maintained continuity across impossible distances and devastating disruptions. You wouldn't have lasted a day as a fire temple keeper, as we've established. Would you have thrived as a priest in ancient Persia? Could you have memorized all those prayers in Avestan? Could you have navigated the politics of temple administration? Could you have balanced spiritual devotion with practical concerns about income and career advancement? Could you have maintained faith through the long, slow decline and eventual collapse of everything your ancestors had built? These are not trivial questions. The priestly class of ancient Persia faced challenges both mundane and extraordinary. They had to master complex ritual knowledge while also functioning as practical religious professionals. They had to maintain piety while also managing economic resources. They had to preserve ancient traditions while also adapting to changing political and social circumstances. Some did this successfully. Others probably failed, lost in the historical record because their failures weren't significant enough to be remembered. But collectively, as a class, they succeeded in preserving Zoroastrianism through circumstances that destroyed many other ancient religions. The fires they tended literally and metaphorically still burn in small communities around the world. That's not a bad legacy for a group of people whose primary qualification was knowing how to recite prayers in a dead language. And so we arrive at the end of our journey through the world of Zoroastrian religion, from the impossible demands of maintaining sacred fire to the life of a visionary prophet, from towers where vultures consumed the dead to the priests who maintained religious authority across centuries of upheaval. If you're still awake, and I'm genuinely uncertain whether to be flattered or concerned if you are, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've explored tonight. We've spent the last 2 hours immersed in a religious tradition that most people today have barely heard of, examining practices that seem alien, sometimes disturbing, occasionally brilliant, and always utterly committed to principles of purity, truth, and cosmic order that governed every aspect of life. Think about the fire temple keeper we discussed at the beginning, waking before dawn in absolute darkness to begin purification rituals that would consume hours of each day. Consider the relentless consistency required, the isolation endured, the total subordination of personal comfort to sacred duty. That person genuinely believed they were maintaining not just a fire, but a symbol of divine truth, pushing back against chaos and falsehood through their daily, unglamorous vigilance. They found meaning in repetition, purpose in ritual, fulfillment in duties we would find intolerably tedious. We've contemplated Zarathustra himself, the priest who had visions by a river, and spent the rest of his life trying to convince people that everything they believed about the gods was wrong, that there was only one supreme deity worthy of worship, that human beings had free will and moral responsibility in a cosmic battle between good and evil. He was rejected, persecuted, driven from his community, and yet persisted until he found a patron who would support his message. 3,000 years later, his hymns are still being recited, his ideas still shaping how people understand the divine. There's something profoundly human about that story. The struggle to communicate a vision that seems obvious to you but incomprehensible to everyone else. The years of failure and rejection. The eventual partial success that comes too late to entirely vindicate your efforts, but arrives in time to ensure your message survives you. How many people throughout history have had similar experiences in smaller ways, convinced they understood some truth that others couldn't or wouldn't see? We've examined those remarkable towers of silence, those circular stone structures where bodies were exposed to vultures, where death was managed according to principles of purity that forbade contaminating the sacred elements of earth, water, and fire. We've considered the theological logic that made this practice sensible, even necessary, and the emotional reality of families watching their loved ones carried into those towers, knowing what would happen next. And we've contemplated how that ancient practice, maintained successfully for over 1,000 years, was ultimately defeated not by religious persecution or cultural change, but by veterinary medicine's accidental poisoning of vulture populations. The towers stand empty now, monuments to a way of confronting death that made perfect sense within its framework and became impossible to maintain when the ecosystem it depended on collapsed. There's a lesson there, perhaps, about the fragility of human institutions, about how practices that seem eternal can be undone by changes no one anticipated or intended. The Zoroastrians who built those towers and maintained them for centuries never imagined that agricultural drugs used on cattle would eventually make their funerary practices impossible. They thought they had solved the problem of death and purity permanently. They were wrong, but their confidence was understandable. We've explored the lives of priests who wielded considerable power and influence, who managed vast temple estates and advised kings, who accumulated wealth while ostensibly focused on spiritual purity, who passed their knowledge from father to son across generations, creating hereditary lineages that persisted for centuries. We've seen how they navigated the tension between spiritual ideals and worldly realities, how they maintained their authority through specialized knowledge and social connections, and how their entire world collapsed when the political order that supported them fell to Arab conquest. And yet, remarkably, the priestly lineages survived. The knowledge was preserved. Small communities maintained the traditions, kept the fires burning, recited the ancient prayers, trained new generations in rituals that no longer brought power or wealth, but still carried meaning and identity. What ties all of this together? What's the common thread running through fire temple keeping, prophetic vision, unusual funerary practices, and priestly authority? Perhaps it's the fundamental human drive to impose order on chaos, to find meaning in ritual, to connect the mundane and the sacred, to believe that our actions matter in some cosmic sense beyond mere survival and reproduction. The Zoroastrians took this drive and developed it into an elaborate system of religious practice that integrated every aspect of life into a framework of purity versus pollution, truth versus falsehood, good versus evil. They believed the universe was engaged in a battle between order and chaos, and that human beings had both the responsibility and the capacity to choose which side they supported through their thoughts, words, and deeds. Every action, no matter how small, contributed to one side or the other. Maintaining a fire properly supported truth and order. Allowing contamination supported chaos and falsehood. Nothing was spiritually neutral. Everything mattered. This is, when you think about it, an exhausting way to live. The constant vigilance required, the endless attention to ritual detail, the perpetual concern about purity and contamination. It's no wonder we began by acknowledging that you wouldn't last a day as a fire temple keeper. Most of us wouldn't. We're comfortable with ambiguity, with moral grayness, with actions that are just actions without cosmic significance. We like our religion, if we have religion at all, to be something we engage with occasionally, rather than something that governs every waking moment. But perhaps there's something we've lost in that comfort. The Zoroastrians, for all the demanding nature of their practices, had certainty. They knew what they believed. They knew what was required of them. They knew their actions mattered. They had a framework that gave meaning to everything, from maintaining a fire, to disposing of the dead, to choosing how to speak and act in daily life. In our modern world, with our tremendous freedom of belief and action, with our skepticism about grand narratives and cosmic battles, we've gained comfort and lost certainty. We can choose how to live without worrying about ritual contamination or divine judgment. But we also have to construct our own meaning, find our own purpose, decide for ourselves what matters and what doesn't. This freedom is precious, but it's also burdensome in ways we don't always acknowledge. I'm not suggesting we should all become Zoroastrians or adopt their practices. That would be absurd and, given the scarcity of vultures and the difficulty of learning Avestan, probably impractical. But there's value in understanding how other people, in other times, found meaning and purpose through religious practices that seem alien to us. The fire temple keeper, maintaining the eternal flame in isolation, found fulfillment in duties we would find maddening. Zarathustra found truth in visions we might dismiss as hallucinations or psychological phenomena. Families found comfort in funerary practices we find disturbing. Priests found meaning in preserving traditions across centuries of upheaval. None of this is less real or less valid because we don't share their beliefs or practices. As you lie there in the darkness, perhaps drifting toward sleep now, perhaps still stubbornly conscious, consider the strangeness and diversity of human religious experience. Consider how much effort people have expended throughout history, trying to understand the divine, trying to live correctly, trying to find meaning in a universe that often seems indifferent to our existence. The Zoroastrians built their temples and tended their fires and exposed their dead to vultures, and trained generation after generation of priests in ancient rituals, all in service of a vision of cosmic order and divine truth that sustained them through empires and exiles, and the long, slow erosion of time. Their religion persists today in small communities, changed from its ancient form, but still recognizably descended from Zarathustra's revelation 3,000 years ago. That's remarkable. That's worth contemplating as you drift toward sleep. The persistence of human attempts to understand and engage with the divine, the creativity we bring to solving religious and philosophical problems, the courage it takes to maintain faith when everything around you is changing or collapsing, the determination to preserve knowledge and tradition across impossible distances and devastating disruptions. You wouldn't have lasted a day as a Zoroastrian fire temple keeper. Neither would I. But we can honor the dedication of those who did, who woke before dawn and performed their ablutions, and recited their prayers and maintained their fires day after day, year after year, generation after generation, believing they were participating in something larger than themselves, something cosmic and eternal and profoundly meaningful. The fires are still burning somewhere. In temples in India, in the few remaining Zoroastrian communities in Iran, flames are being tended by priests who can trace their lineage back through centuries of continuous practice to ancient Persia, to the magi who advised kings, to the firekeepers who lived in isolation, to Zarathustra himself and his vision of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, the source of all truth and goodness and order in the universe. Those priests are maintaining traditions that seem impossibly ancient to us, that connect them to a world of Bronze Age prophets and Persian empires and towers where vultures once consumed the dead. They're preserving something fragile and precious, not just religious practices but human memory, institutional continuity, the thread of tradition that links the present to the distant past. And now, you know something about that tradition. You understand, at least intellectually, what motivated these practices and beliefs. You can picture the fire temple keeper performing his mourning ablutions, the mourners following a corpse to the Tower of Silence, the young priest memorizing Avestan prayers he doesn't yet understand, all of them participants in a religious tradition that has shaped their lives and identities in ways both obvious and subtle. This knowledge won't transform your life. It won't solve your problems or answer your questions or provide you with certain meaning, but it might expand your understanding of human religious diversity, of the remarkable variety of ways people have found to engage with questions of meaning, purpose, purity, death, and the divine. And that's worth something, even if it's just intellectual appreciation, rather than personal transformation. Sleep now, if you can. Rest in the comfort of your modern life, where you don't have to wake before dawn to perform purification rituals, where fires are maintained automatically with thermostats and gas lines, where the dead are handled by professionals according to sanitation codes, where religious practice is optional and religion itself is just one aspect of life, rather than the organizing principle of all existence. But perhaps, as you drift off, spare a thought for those ancient fire keepers, for Zarathustra composing his hymns to Ahura Mazda, for families confronting death within frameworks of purity and contamination, for priests preserving traditions across centuries. They were human beings like us, trying to make sense of existence, trying to live meaningfully, trying to connect with something larger than themselves. The fires burned, the towers stood, the prayers were recited, the traditions were preserved. And now, 3,000 years later, you know something about it all. You've spent 2 hours learning about a religion most people have never heard of, exploring practices that seem bizarre and beautiful and disturbing and logical all at once. Was it worth it? Did you learn something? Did it help you sleep? Only you can answer those questions. But the fires are still burning somewhere, maintained by someone's dedicated effort, and that's remarkable enough on its own. Good night. May you dream of fires that never go out, of towers open to the sky, of priests reciting prayers in languages no one speaks anymore, of truths preserved across impossible expanses of time. And if you wake tomorrow morning without having to perform elaborate purification rituals before you can start your day, perhaps feel a moment of gratitude for the freedom and comfort of modern life, even as you appreciate the dedication of those who found meaning in practices you would find impossible to maintain. The eternal flame burns on, the tradition persists, the story continues, and you, having heard it, are now part of that continuation, carrying some small fragment of knowledge about Zoroastrianism into the future, even if it's just enough to bore your friends at parties or to finally fall asleep after 2 hours of learning about ancient Persian fire worship. Either way, mission accomplished. Rest well.